Hope you're enjoying lunch. We have our fine food from Abby's Kitchen. We're delighted to have them here. I do have one announcement about this evening. I have banquet tickets in my pocket. Some people who we thought might be going to the banquet are flying out or something like that. They've turned them back in, so if there are some students or some spouses or relatives or whatnot, and you would like a banquet ticket, you could talk to any of the ACRC staff, myself, Brad Ewing, Brittany Lenhart, and Heather Bennett. And we'd like to, make sure if there are folks who would like to come that that's available to them as well. Another one of our great partners in our partnership network of 16 organizations strong is the USGS Alaska area. Having come on board a year and a half ago or so, nearly a month or two after I got into this role with the Rainforest Center. And I have the honor of introducing Carl Markon, who's a Deputy Regional Executive for USGS in Alaska. And he also previously served or concurrently served as the Director of the Alaska Science Center. Prior to joining the USGS, he was a remote sensing research geographer in Alaska for 18 years and a natural resource specialist with the Fish and Wildlife Service. He also previously served as co-chair of the Alaska Geographic Data Committee. So please warmly welcome Carl Markon.
Thanks, Mike. Mike did a really good job since I didn't give him a bio at all, so I'm pretty impressed with that. Sometimes it's a little scary to take paper out of your pocket like this because people think, oh my God, he's going to read a lot. And it's only 8-point font, single-spaced, so not a problem. I really want to thank Mike and all of his staff for what they've done for the symposium. It's really been great, and I'm really impressed with the speakers that he's got. They're really articulate, much more than I am. That's why I'm a regional executive, and they only give me 3 minutes to do this. But they've been really good speakers. I've been really impressed, and they're really interesting. And it's really stirred a lot of informative thinking on my part, and a little bit different thinking in some regards as well. So I think that's a really good sign for the center as a start, because they have been pretty new at this. They've only been in existence for a couple of years, I think, and USGS has only been a partner for maybe a year and a half or something like that. And I've really had a lot of fun interacting with Mike and his staff and the mayor, Bruce, here, who I was actually really impressed. One of the first meetings I came down here for the center was sort of an information gathering meeting, and we had Fish and Wildlife Service and other entities, University of Alaska and whatnot. And I found out that he was a mayor, and I thought, okay, he's going to give sort of an introductory speech and then go about and do his mayoral business. He spent all the full 2 days through those meetings, all day there, and I was really impressed with that. And that just shows the kind of dedication and the background, the backup that you need to make a center like this as a success. And I think with the amount of partners that we have in the center, including the USGS, I think it's going to be a real successful activity that goes into the future. One of the things that Mike wanted to do is sort of give an idea of what's in it for the USGS to be a partner in this center. And I think if you look at the website and you look at the mission statement and whatnot, there's a lot of similarities to what they do to what the USGS does. And that's facilitating science. USGS does a lot of science, and a lot of people think that we only do geologic science, but that's not true. We actually do a lot of different types of science, ranging from geology to carbon sequestration studies, hydrologic studies, biology studies, fisheries studies. So we actually run that full gamut. So we have a lot of similarities that the Coastal Science Center, the Rainforest Science Center here, might be engaged in, and there's a lot of opportunities that we can work together. Now, the USGS in Southeast hasn't really done a lot of work we've done a lot of nearshore work and offshore work as far as seabird work, feeder fisheries, a lot of otter work up in sea otter work up in Prince William Sound. So in that regards, we've done a lot of work offshore environment, but we haven't really done a lot of work on the terrestrial side, except for some maybe bedrock mineral work that we've done for the Forest Service down here. So I see with our engagement here with the center, there's a lot of interactions that we can do, and there's a lot of linkages that we can start looking at with the center, looking maybe primarily at the terrestrial environment, and then a lot of the nearshore and offshore work that the USGS does. So that synergy could be a real important benefit to the both of us. Another thing with the website, it talks about integrated science, and that's really important. A lot of times in the past, we've looked at issues using single science disciplines, and Rick Edwards today was talking about it with all these little boxes. Well, how do you make all those boxes come together? And we at the USGS are trying to do that now. Is instead of looking at an issue on a problem in a narrow way, we're trying to look at it across disciplines and look at multiple questions to solve those issues. So I think in that regard, we can work really well with the center here as well. Another thing that's sort of exciting for us is that in the past, we haven't done a lot with integrating traditional ecological knowledge, and I know that's one of the things that the center is going to get involved with. So I think that's another opportunity for the USGS to come in and get involved with the center and then start to learn how to do that integration with the traditional ecological knowledge. So I guess the only other comment is that there's a lot of partnerships here. I think we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to share with each other, and I think this will be a really good venue to do that. And I didn't use this at all.
Thank you, Carl. Today for lunch, we have a nice presentation. Dolores Garza is Professor Emerita at the University of Alaska. Her research is focused on subsistence management, marine mammal management, marine safety, and traditional use of marine resources by Alaska Native cultures. Dr. Garza is a subsistence harvester, is familiar with the consumptive and artistic uses of many resources statewide, and is able to use both her academic knowledge with her cultural skills and values. She is of Haida heritage. Dr. Garza has a bachelor's in fisheries science from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, a master's in fisheries from the University of Washington, and a PhD in marine policy from the University of Delaware. Today, Dolly Garza will speak about climate change and the changing village life. Please welcome Dolly Garza and her entourage.
Before I start my talk, we need to follow a little bit of protocol, and we've asked David if he could please say a few words on behalf of our presenter this morning.
Gunalchish, Ha'itrayatani Yatutat, Gunalchish, Achat, Aksi, Gunalchish, Yukatangi. Thank you very much for taking the time and giving us this time to acknowledge Elaine. She referenced the Tequedi clan. She also talked about other clans that were in this area, and it's inappropriate for us not to give balanced and respond. And so I'm going to ask the Tequedi if they could come and give a few words of appreciation.
Gunashchish, Chusha, Anyatku, you are my precious beloved auntie. I want to speak as though your father's speaking to you to say how proud he is of you for lifting him up. My house leader, Frank Jack, Kagis Geik, also acknowledges you and the work that you're doing for our children and our children's children. We're in debt to you, Gunashchish.
Oxy, Kashka Kwan, Aktwasi Gugunis Chish, Kashka Kwan, Dani Kukat Dosak, Hoots Nakatsati, Tekwedi Ayakhat, Saxman Yekat Yati, Aktwasi Gugunis Chish, Yakhe Wustini.
And I just want to acknowledge these young people and put a little plug in for them. This is Tlingit and Haida. What is the title of the group again? The Environmental Youth Group, Heen Satini. So I just want to acknowledge them and thank you. And I want to sing a little song because this is Tlingit science. And it's everything works together. Goes like this. Woo Jean, ye jikach tune, ye jikach tune. Woo Jean, ye jikach tune, ye jikach tune. We yo kolila.
Just real quickly, to David, Hawa for lifting me up the other day when I spoke about subsistence. I did want to give this to you when you were up here, but you snuck off on me. It's one of my books, The Common Guides to the Edible Seaweeds of Alaska. And we had talked about it would be nice to do something that includes Tlingit and Haida along with that, and maybe Judy, you could come back for your mother since she snuck off on me as well. I was adopted into the Luknahadi and given the name Hat Shawat, which is spruce root woman. And so when Elaine spoke about how spruce root gave birth to a baby that was tied with the umbilical cord of the spruce root, and I knew that I had to thank Elaine for sharing that story with us. So this is a spruce root medicine bag that I wove, and I hope that she enjoys it. What we heard this morning from Elaine was quite phenomenal, and in a way it scared me because I know nothing compared to her, and in many ways it lifted me up because it gave me the strength to talk today. I have the benefit of having the education from my grandma and my aunties and my uncles, and combining that with the university education, and then working for the University of Alaska for 24 years as an outreach educator. It has tied three things together well for me so that I can feel comfortable speaking. And as a professor, you could probably stick me in front of a mic and I could talk about anything for 20 minutes, as long as you gave me 10 minutes notice. What I'd like to talk about today is how we as Native people are trying to respond to the world as it's continually changing. And we certainly heard that yesterday, that it has changed in the millennium, it has changed in the thousands of years. We have stories that go back to the Ice Age, both in the Yakutat area, in the Taku area, and certainly down where I live now in the Haida Gwaii area. We are not opposed to change, but we need to be a part of it, and we need to understand it. And the world that we know and have known for the last couple thousand years is changing quicker than is allowing our culture to adapt to it. And I think that all of us could say that, but we feel a little bit on unsettled grounds at this time. This was a map that Dr. Langdon put up this morning. This is one that Andy Hope worked on for many years, and it shows the territories of the Tlingit as well as the Haida. And it's interesting to note in that bottom box that these territories and the ownership of the resources were very well documented by the earlier explorers, by Nullback back in 1885, 86, 87, when he did work up here. He noted that the streams and the bays and the berry bushes and the places where you gather chocolate lily roots were owned by clans and were owned by families. And it was through the management of those resources that those communities continued to thrive in those areas. So territories were protected, I imagine initially, through very strong arms, because a clan, a tribe, a community learned over time what they needed in order to survive as a community. They needed fresh water, they needed protection, they needed, of course, in southeast salmon streams, they needed berries and greens, they needed access to halibut grounds or black cod grounds, to be able to have access to herring spawn areas or to be able to trade, needed access to the woods in order to make our houses and many of our tools and our boxes, and to shellfish and seaweed beds. And so when we looked at where we were going to live as a community, we had to think of many things and our access to them. And that became our territory. So cultural survival, no matter what part of the world you're in, I think, depends on this long-term relationship with the land. And as we term it in newer terms, it's resource conservation, the proper allocation of resources over time, such that you continue to be able to use the resource without depleting it. And this was in large part what the earlier explorers saw when they came up to Southeast Alaska. The lands appeared untouched. They appeared virgin lands, and yet over 20,000 natives lived in Southeast Alaska and had lived there for a number of hundreds of years, of thousands of years, but they had properly managed the use of their resources by creating these territories and by properly allocating these resources so that they were used properly. It requires sustainable harvest practices, and it requires generational protection and access to these resources. And this is where some of the changes have happened in the last 100 years, in the last 50 years, in the last 10 years as the state of Alaska has grown. When we look at this wealth of information of how do we carry it forward from generation to generation, we have these culture bearers that we have in Elaine. And in Herman Kitka is just an example. He was one of the wisest men that I've ever met, and I was so fortunate to be able to spend many years with him in Sitka listening to him as he talked about Sitka in a way that it would take all of you as scientists to talk about. He could do that in a week if you would have the time to listen to him. So it's that kind of information that gets passed forward from generation to generation so that we continue to use these resources properly. Some of that, of course, has changed. Sometimes we're not listening when we should be listening. And that was certainly one of my problems as I went off to college, is that I went away listening to these stories, and to me they were legends. The legend of the boy who became a salmon that Dr. Langdon talked about this morning. In my mind, it was a story. And for so many years, I didn't understand the ethics that were embedded in it. And when I finally learned them, it was like I finally understood the value of what I had been learning, and I had to learn how to look with a different set of eyes. So if you haven't heard this legend or you haven't read about it, it's about a boy who, and this legend is found in Haida and Tlingit and Tsimshian legend because it's important, the ethics that you learn from it. It varies a little different in each of the cultures, but it is still teaching you the same thing. It's about a young boy whose mother is, at least in the Haida culture, is the sister of a chief. And so this boy could possibly grow up and be a chief. He's an important boy. He's an important young man. And so he was given this copper collar to show his status when he was quite young, that he would wear and people would know who he was. In another culture, he's given an abalone earring. He is a little bit spoiled, which is generally not the way Tlingit children were raised or Haida children. We grew up learning to do things properly. But this boy happened to be a little bit spoiled, and he got away with things. He was playing down at the beach, and he was torturing something, either a seagull or a clam, and he shouldn't have been. And he got hungry, and he went and he ran to his mom, and he said, "What can I eat?" He shouldn't have been raised by his mother. He should have been raised by his aunties. And they gave him a piece of last year's fish, and it had a little bit of mold on it, and he said, "I'm too important to eat this kind of fish," and he threw it on the ground. And he ran back to playing, and he heard something. He heard something, and he went to investigate, and he was never seen again. The auntie and the mom finally realized he was gone, and everybody looked. They looked for days, they looked for weeks, they looked for the whole summer, and they never found him. And they finally had to leave the summer camp and go away and think perhaps that they had lost him. But they had not. He went to the salmon people. They came and got him because they had to teach him that you don't treat salmon parts disrespectfully and throw them away because it has a little mold on it. They took him away and down into their salmon village, and they kept him for how long, depending on which species you're talking about, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, depending on the legend. And as Dr. Langdon was saying, when they came back, they were saying, "Go look and see if we're close." And he jumps up, and that's the fish jump, I-O. And he jumps up again, and he's coming into the stream, and the ladies are there this summer, several summers later. And they see this beautiful fish, and they have to catch it, and so they get a net, and they catch it right away, and they're going to just eat it right away because it looks so good. And they get their knife ready, their ulu ready to cut it up, and when they put their ulu down there, what they see is this copper. And they know that something is different. And so the whole community gets together and they talk about what they should do, and they treat this fish properly because they know that something is different. And they put it on top of the smokehouse, and they sing to it, and they cover it with down, and in a few days they can hear noise, and they can hear noise, and pretty soon it's the noise of a young man. And he comes down, and it's this boy, only he's grown up, of course, because he's been gone for several summers. And he sits everyone down, and he says, "This is what I learned from the salmon people, that we are to treat them with respect when we have not, that we are to show them proper ceremony when they come back, that we are to keep that stream clean so that they can come back home because it's their home, that we are to, when we show them respect and eat that salmon, return the bones back, at least to the first salmon, so the spirit of the salmon can return back and say, these are good people, we should come and give ourselves to them." This is what he tells his family. This is what he tells his community. And so they do that. They honor the salmon. They cease all activities in the river. They return the bones to the river. And for the first probably 35 years that I heard this story, what I understood was respect. But those are not the only things that are to be learned. With the first salmon ceremony, you have to look with anticipation and hope and joy that the salmon will be coming back. That creates this love in the environment for the fish. In honoring the honoring ceremony, it takes a number of days to get the materials ready, to get eagle down, to weave new cedar mats, to bring people in from where they are and make sure they're there to honor that first salmon that's coming in. During that time, salmon are going up the river, they're going up the stream. This is what it's called now, is escapement. By showing that respect at the beginning, it's providing the escapement of salmon up the stream in order to provide for future generations. So it's not a group of people that are taking every single fish that come up. It's a group of people that are allowing fish to go up the stream and doing the proper ceremony and honoring. Required all in-river activities to cease so that they could come home to a clean home. And of course, that's the clean environment that we all aspire to when we think of beautiful salmon streams. And it is that respect that I grew up hearing about and knowing about. That respect has to be there. And then finally, returning the bodies to the water, what we're doing is returning the nutrients to the system. We have in Washington, Oregon, dead salmon carcasses that are being hauled up by helicopter over the dams because they finally understood that those nutrients are necessary to the future generations of salmon. And so if you look at some of these legends, some of these stories, some of these histories, they are telling us more than respect. If we look a little deeper, we will find them. In another story, the Herring Rock story, I won't talk about it because we did lose one of the Kiksadi matriarchs, Isabel Brady, and my heart is heavy for her loss. But if you take the time to look up that story in Sitka, you'll find an amazing amount of respect, but also of biological conservation methods. They are in that story. So how do you go from being someone like me who grew up listening to these stories and trying to figure them out to saying, okay, well, I work for an agency, what am I going to do? It's a big jump there. There are many ways that this kind of information can be incorporated into the knowledge base that we have now. Through interviews, biographies, field trips, books, there is so much historic information that has already been gathered that's just in books, in shelves, in somewhere, that every time I pull down one of those books and start reading, I'm just amazed at what I've learned beyond just the story of Herman Kitka or of some elders from somewhere. Just in telling us what they're doing, we're learning about the resources during that time. That's very, very valuable information to have. And then also interviewing the elders now, because right now we're at the age where we are losing the last of the culture bearers that had so much information. It's sad every time we lose someone like Isabella or Herman Kitka or Leonard Cato down in Klawock. We have to start interviewing these people, and this lower picture is in Haida, my husband. They did a whole 3 years of interviewing all the elders that they could about traditional ecological knowledge, uses of Haida Gwaii. They just committed to do that, and they did it. That information now is very valuable as they go forward with Enbridge, as they go forward with land claims, as they go forward with co-management. They've got information that is in reports, that is in video, that is held by the tribe, so it won't be lost. It's very important to start doing these things. Just a couple examples of projects that have been done. I'm retired, so this is old information, but the Marine Mammal Protection Act allowed for small boat surveys, co-management effort between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Alaska Sea Otter Stellar Sea Lion Commission. This allowed for tribes to contract to receive the monies, to work with the federal agencies to develop surveys, to develop protocols, to develop and implement their plan on surveying sea otters in their area, about doing their transects, counting them using local people who are knowledgeable of hazards in the coastal area, who are knowledgeable about when you can go out, who are willing to go out every year at about the same time, because that makes that information relevant over time. These kinds of projects are very, very valuable because they do provide consistent data over time and place. It gives you a place to start with as you do additional work, and this kind of information has been used when there was a spill in Unalaska. They had to go to the Unalaska tribe and say, are there sea otters in that area? And Unalaska tribe said, well, we've got some good data. Let's sit down at the table and let's work together. Another project that I was involved with was testing seagull eggs for contaminants. It was something that we thought might take 6 months and took over 3 years. We thought might take a small pot of money and took a fairly large pot of money. But it was very, very valuable. It was EPA funded. We had 5 communities that committed to the project. We probably had another 20 communities that tried to get into the project because they wanted seagull eggs tested. We chose seagull eggs because people eat them from Metlakatla up to Kotzebue. The tribes committed to the project. They committed personnel. They committed to the training. They committed to collecting everything that they needed to using a standard protocol, about getting all the data down properly, about turning it in so that it was done, everything was done properly so that we had good data. The eggs were sent out and they were tested. They were analyzed, and the data which belonged to the tribes were brought back to them. So we went around to the 5 communities, Sitka, Togiak, Unalaska, Mikoyak, and Kotzebue, and reported their data back to them. This is just an idea of the kind of data we provided. It was kind of a sad thing to report back to because there were contaminants. All the contaminants were there, all of them. And there were several spikes. And we had to report that to Unalaska. They had a spike. And I felt so bad reporting it. And they said, don't, Dolly, because you know what? We always knew it. We just never had the data. We never had the proof. You've given us the information that we need to go forward and try and get more tests done and try and get more tests done on other subsistence foods in that area. The other values of this kind of projects is it provided capacity building for those 5 communities. None of them said, oh, I'd never do that again. They said, what else can we do? The research results were valuable to the communities because we worked on a species that was important to their diet. The results were gathered. All the data was done properly. It was reviewed by an outside biologist. It was stamped with approval. It was good data. And the reports went back to the agency as well as to the communities. Other kinds of projects that are ongoing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, with the federal subsistence process, Fishery Information Service provides small pots of money for tribes to work either by themselves as through granting processes or through agencies to look at what are the needs in fisheries in Southeast Alaska, in South Central Alaska, up in Northern Alaska. And it's been very valuable to Southeast, where we, as a Southeast region, are focused on the commercial aspect. We are focused on the strength or weaknesses of a stock that provides millions of dollars to trollers and seiners and gill netters. And that's good. All my uncles were fishermen. But we also needed to find the pots of money for the villages of Heidelberg to look at Haida, for the villages of Angoon to look at the health of their stocks in their region, for the village of Sitka to look at readout. Those kinds of small pots of money are very valuable, and when you work the tribe and the agency together, then you really create really, really nice groups of people that have the same ideals. They want the same outcome in terms of good information that they can use, and they're willing to work together. And they've worked, from what I understand, very, very well from the reports I've seen. So what is the importance of tribal and community research and management? I have focused on the tribal side because for the last 10 years, that's where the money was. But there are certainly a number of communities, at least in Southeast, that are very tied to the land that they live in, to places like Teneke or Port Alexander, to Whale Pass on Prince of Wales Island. Those kinds of people that live in those communities intend to stay there and raise their children there and have a vested interest in the welfare, in the healthy ecosystem of that area. So what are the benefits? Well, we have tribes and communities spread over all of Alaska. So it's not like, you know, Fish and Game or ADF&G that's largely centered in Juneau or Anchorage. We have access to people that are in the community. They know when you should be looking at resources. If you're going to go out on a boat, they know how to read the weather and whether or not it's safe. They have collective memories. If they're not sure, they can go ask their uncles or their aunties, and they can provide good information so that as you start pulling projects together, you're going in the right direction and not making a fatal mistake that could put you off for a whole season. Additional benefits is that there are communities and tribes that can access money that you may not be able to access as an agency. I know in Canada, DFO just pulled out of this huge, major, multi-million-dollar initiative because there may be some political bent to it. They walked away from $4 million, and the tribe said, okay, we'll take it. So you have opportunities to work with tribes that can access those kinds of funds. They're doing marine planning down on Haida Gwaii and basically a lot of British Columbia coast, where the funds come from California, from a private foundation. And they want to work with the tribes. They want to work with the communities. They want to look at how marine plans should be developed when you consider the communities in them. And there's lots of reasons here, but one of the important ones is just the ability of those communities and those members to respond quickly. That's been very important in terms of like stranded marine mammal responses. If you have an oil spill and you need someone to run out and look at whether or not it's going to be major or minor. I know that Cordova people complained for years that they were not allowed to respond immediately to Exxon, and that if they could have responded immediately, they could have stopped a lot of that oil from hitting the beach. And so working with communities and tribes to pull those kinds of projects together can only lead to good, in my opinion. I think probably my 5 minutes are almost up, eh? Okay, so looking at what are the needs? You know, the examples that I have are relatively old, but there are opportunities to go forward. What can we look at? I know when the walrus were being looked at, being listed, that there was absolutely no information on, did the diet change significantly, that the amount of fat or proteins or nutrients that they were getting affect the health of their body. And who had that information was the hunters. Because when they would get walrus, they would cut open the stomachs. Because if the clams in there were still relatively fresh, they'd go home and eat them, because getting clams up there was relatively hard because they're fairly deep watered. But they would know with the marine mammals, if you go in and you get your seal tagged, if you get your sea otter tagged, you do a level 1 or level 2 necropsy. What was the condition of the fat? Did you notice any changes in any of the organs? Did you notice any changes in hair loss of the pelt? So you're asking the hunters for information that they have right in front of them. That kind of information is very, very valuable to gather, and it's gathered from stocks that may or may not have an issue. So if you're gathering it on sea otters for all of Southeast Alaska, you're gathering the data on healthy stocks, so that if something happens, you have some good baseline data. So again, going back to the salmon populations in Southeast, so many of the streams that we had talked about have been impacted by things like mining or timber harvesting or road building or people moving and putting up houses. What is the status and what is the health of those streams? It's the people that live closest that will care enough to do the kind of work over time, and if they're trained to do it properly, will gladly do it. One that's closest to me, and I know it has been talked about by Forest Service, is do we have the same access to cedar? I know that there is a decline in yellow cedar. Have we talked to the weavers and asked them, how much of a decline have you seen? Has it affected your ability to get cedar bark for weaving? With spruce root, which I love dearly, what has changed? Has anything changed? Do you harvest later? Is it a shorter opportunity? For both of these resources, there's generally a narrow opportunity to harvest. And if you miss it, you've missed it for the whole year. And so has anything in the climate changed enough that makes it difficult for you to harvest, either by shortening that period or making it very stormy during those times? That kind of information is valuable to gather for the community, but would also provide some good big picture analysis or big picture view of what's going on in that environment. And then one I've been thinking about is, in driving out with Elaine, we saw the skunk cabbage, and she goes, "Oh, I bet the seaweed's ready." And that's one of the things I grew up knowing, is when the skunk cabbage is out, you better be out picking your black seaweed or you're going to miss it for the year. Very short picking opportunity. Do those kinds of associations of what you see on the land and what you can do in the ocean, do they still hold? Around Skidegate, we were told by one of the elders, when you see the pink blossoms on the salmon berries, that's when the halibut are moving up close and you don't have to go far to harvest them. Does that still hold? So it'd be interesting to pull together those kinds of relationships and find out if they do still hold from community to community. What are those little tricks? What do they know, and are they still there? So when we look at community research, quite often it's describing what's there. It's trying to understand those relationships, what's happening, what's returning or not returning, and what has changed. In looking at developing a project with a community or a tribe, what I have found is that you need to be very specific, and this is required for both sides. You need to develop clear plans of what you want to do, what timeline you're going to do it in, who has a responsibility and the rights to data, to information, to presenting that information, doing local training. If you're doing something that is on a broad scale, like we did with the small boat survey or the seagull egg contaminant study, required bringing the communities into a central location and doing the training so that they understood why things had to be standardized, and were more than willing to do that because they wanted that information to be valuable. And they understood why standardization works. That was very, very easy to do. And then make sure you have a clear deadline of when you want things done and that you have the financing to do it. What was most important was that co-ownership is key. And so we don't want to go out and interview a bunch of elders and then they're a footnote in a paper. They have to be more than that. And many community members in tribal community agencies are certainly willing to be more than that. And so we need to step up on both sides and say, okay, we're both going to agree to things that will probably make us hurt a little bit, but in the end, we're going to end up with something that's going to bring us forward as we ponder what the changes are and how they will impact us. So, I like this picture. As we look at the impacts of humans on the environment, and we have, deer that to say, well, I was here first, I'm staying here. We have people that are willing to work on it. I know that's why you're here. Usually when I've given this talk in the past, it was to colleagues or agencies or staff that would say, well, I'm not going to do research if it has to be relative to the community, then it isn't really research. I'm not doing applied research. I have to do research for myself, for my expertise, for my area of interest. And that isn't always going to hold, because we'll see, even in the state of Alaska, where funding sometimes is tied to your ability to work with that community. That's the case with the Denali Commission, or at least it was at one time. That's the case with the Fishery Information Service monies. If you work with the community, you're more likely to get the funding, and you're more likely to address an issue that is relevant to the community, but still provides good data on looking at what the future may hold for us. So with that, I thank you very much. Sure. Questions? So it's completely clear, and you guys all understand everything. We're going to walk away and start introducing yourselves to each other and get these projects going. I'm very, very, very happy to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolly, for coming this distance and for talking with us. I hope people will ask their questions to Dr. Garza during this afternoon and evening. I guess I'd like to really thank Brittany, who came up with the wonderful idea to bring Dolly to town and worked hard on the logistics and getting her here. I probably should have done this sooner, but I would like to thank KTOO and 360 North for a lot of the efforts in getting this not only streaming, because I've been receiving text messages from all around the country from different people who are engaged in this as an audience, but also for putting it, it's going to be broadcast on 360 North after the special session's over. And then we'll have hard drives. It'll be video on demand for some period of time, and we'll announce that. So thank you, team, for your hard work. This afternoon we have the third of our 3 concurrent sessions. We have a little bit of a break now. We'll get started at 2 o'clock. Bruce Botello in here, public policy session, ballroom 1. Faith Duncan and company, a large company of educators, called Change at Your Doorstep, in ballroom 3. So policy or education. Then we'll have a break, and we'll start a poster session at 5 o'clock with a no-host bar, dinner at 6, and Peter Kriva back up at 7 o'clock. Have a good break, intermingle, ask your questions, network, think about the great messages that Dr. Garza just left with us. See you at 2.